Right, year 7, so now we're going to be having a look at creating our feather texture, okay? And we're going to think about the shape, the tone and the lines that we need to create. So the shape, basically, first of all, we're going to have to draw this long curved line here. It starts off thicker at the bottom and then gets thinner as it reaches over to this side here. And then we've got these sections, okay, which sort of curve out towards the bottom and the sort of wave even more towards the top. And then we're going to have to add lots of flourish lines into them. So we're working on something that is quite similar to the bear fur here, but there's a slightly different process involved to make sure that we are creating that very clear texture of a feather, okay? So I'm going to remove my image for now so you can see a little bit more clearly what I'm working on here. And you can see I've already started making you an example on this part of the page, but I am going to zoom in a little bit for you. So you can see just a little bit clearer what I am doing, okay? So when you start this texture off, you are going to have to start drawing that centre section, that sort of vein that runs down the centre of the feather, okay? So we need to start that in the bottom left corner, and it should be reaching up to the other side, just above the centre on the right hand side, and it should be wider where we are at the bottom, and then as we curve up, it should get a little bit thinner towards the top, okay? And you can see I'm just sketching this nice and lightly because we are going to be going over it with tone, and if we make a mistake and we're not happy with our curve, we need to be able to rub it out, okay? So the next step is that we're going to go in and we're going to create these sections of the feather as it breaks up, because quite often the feathers, you remember, they're from birds. They used to keep the birds waterproof and stop them getting too cold and wet in the winter. So some of the strands of the feathers, I know we all think they're quite individual, but some of them actually sort of lock together to protect the bird and keep the bird warm. So what we're going to do is we're going to sketch in those little sections, and we're just going to do little curvy triangular breaks, if you like, between each section of the feather. Now some of those triangular sections can be a little bit wider, some of them can be a little bit shorter, some of them can be a little bit longer, but I'm actually looking at my image and I'm trying to pick out where the little breaks in between the feather sections are. Now it doesn't matter if you can't end up fitting it all in, as long as you are trying to get some of the similar marks, lines, etc. within your work that you can see in the feather. Okay, so there's my first bottom row done. Then when I go up towards the top of the row, it's slightly different because the feather sort of curves slightly in almost this sort of like S shape, okay? So when I'm creating my sections for the top, rather than just creating little triangles, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create that S-like shape, and I'm going to reach up to the top of my box, and then I'm going to have the back of that shape sort of curve round again, but I'm keeping the bottom slightly wider and the top slightly narrower. And then for each of my sections, that's what I'm going to sort of sketch in, is those little S shapes breaking up some of my feathers. Sort of like that. Okay, so then once we've blocked out our shapes and we've got our different sections of the feather, then we need to start going in and making the tone and the mark making. So to make this centre section here look 3D, what we need to do is we need to add a little bit of shading down each edge of that vein in the centre of the feather, that hard part that holds the whole feather together, because that's then going to make that look 3D. And what you can do as well is you can take your finger and you can give that a little finger smudge, and that'll just make that look a little bit softer and a little bit more like the picture that we are looking at. Okay, so then we've got that centre section. Once we've done the centre section, we then need to start working on these individual little bits of feather strands, and I'm going to show you how to do the bottom sections first. So we are quite used to doing flourishes now. We know that we need to push and we need to flick out towards the bottom. Okay, so this time we need to use lots of different tones together, so we can push quite hard, we can push quite lightly, we can do medium ones. But I think the trick with this is because we're creating something that's really light and floaty, like a feather, you have to keep your lines really quite thin, and you have to make sure that you're releasing that pressure quite quickly, so you get this really sort of light, delicate edge. So if you can see what I'm doing here, I am doing it quite thick. I've got a super sharp pencil so that my lines do stay nice and thin and feathery, and I am releasing the pressure really quickly. So as soon as I've pushed on for that base, I then release it quite quickly and pull it away, so that I'm not getting too many sort of really thick lines, and it's rather just lots of thin lines that are building up closer together. Okay, if you feel like you need some darker sections, use layering to do that. So don't just make your lines thicker, go back in over the top and add more lines on top rather than trying to make your lines thicker, because we do need to keep our lines quite thin and quite delicate in order to create the delicate texture of the feather that we have here. Okay, so at the bottom it's quite simple in that we are just creating a simple little drop. So we're pushing down and we're just adding quite a simple curve that flattens out towards the bottom for those sections, because we haven't got a lot of the feather down here. But when we come up into the top section of the feather, it then becomes much more difficult, because obviously we have to create this curve as well, and these lines are super long, so it's going to be really difficult to do that in one movement of our pencil. Okay, so we're going to have to actually use multiple marks to make each of those lines. So I find it easiest for me if I sort of tilt my page, and I'm going to again start down at the bottom, and I am going to create those flourishes, and I am going to flick off those lines. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move up a level, and I'm going to continue to do that, but this time I'm pushing lighter, and I'm still trying to focus on keeping my lines nice and thin, and then I'm just following the shape of that curve. Okay, so then I'd come back down to the bottom, I'd start again with the next one, and I'd start making some flourish lines, and again I'd come up a little bit further, making them nice and thin, keeping them nice and light. Okay, so rather than making sort of one line that goes all the way, which is probably not going to work as well, I'm creating some little flicks at the bottom, and then coming up, releasing my pressure to make that media turn in the middle, and then coming up even lighter towards the top, and just using multiple lines to do it. Now it's quite difficult to control, so you may find that you have to go back over a little bit to get it, make it look like it's all one thing coming together, but practice really does make perfect. So just have a go and start off lightly, because then obviously if you make a mistake and it doesn't really work very well, yes, you can rub out, but then you can also work back on top. Whereas if you go in too dark to start off with, perhaps you won't be able to correct it and go back over. So if you do need a darker tone, it is easier to then just layer up those lines and make them a little bit darker. Okay, so now that I've showed you how to make the two different types of feather marks, the ones on the bottom and the ones on the top, I'm going to leave it over to you for you to finish off with yours.